It's 1965, the final year of the 1.5-litre formula. Jim Clark and Lotus had an ambitious program with Grand Prix racing.
That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And the Indianapolis 500.
The first turn, AJ's Point, Dan Gurney and Sonny Jones in close pursuit.
In sports cars, Ford was putting the pressure on Ferrari and were determined to win at Le Mans. The World Championship began on New Year's Day in South Africa. Jim Clark led from flag to flag. For most of the race, he was shadowed by new teammate Mike Spence, but Spence spun on lap 60 and dropped behind John Surtees and Graham Hill. Fifth was Bruce McLaren, and the final point went to Formula One debutant Jackie Stewart in the BRM. Only 35 of the 238 crews in the Monte Carlo rally reached the finish, the smallest number for 20 years. Bob Slaughtermarker was 14th in his Triumph Spitfire. Third was Pat Moss-Carlson. She and husband Eric helped Saab to take the Charles Theroux Trophy for the team prize ahead of the BMC Mini Coopers. Leading into the final stage was the Mini Cooper driven by Finland's Timo Mäkinen and England's Paul Easter, the only entry that had lost no points on the run to Monte Carlo. The final night's 610-kilometre stage was held in a blinding snowstorm in the mountains of southeast France. Timo Mäkinen and Paul Easter continued the Mini's dominance of the Monte Carlo. Runner-up was Germany's Eugen Böhringer in a Porsche. The sabring 12-hour race opened the sports car season. First away, the Corvette Grand Sport of Delmo Johnson and Dave Morgan. The Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe of Lou Spencer, Jim Adams and Phil Hill. Setting the pace was the Chaparral 2A of Hap Sharp and Jim Hall, teammates to the number 4 car of Ronnie Hissam and Bruce Jennings. Leading the Ford Challenge was the Ken Miles Bruce McLaren GT40, entered by Shelby American. 7.5 hours into the race, a deluge covered the track. While others struggled on, the leading Chaparral waited in the pits for 15 minutes to let the flood subside and to save being drowned. A concerned Carroll Shelby. Jim Hall and Hap Sharp won the race by 4 laps from the Miles McLaren GT40 and the David Piper Tony Maggs Ferrari 250LM. The other famous rally on the calendar was the East Africa Safari, based in Kenya. 2 Kenyan brothers, Yoginder and Yaswant Singh, drove their Volvo PV544 to victory. They led for almost all the tough 5,000 kilometres. Only 15 of the 85 starters finished. Heavy rains over the final section of the southern leg to Mombasa had turned the course into mud. The main non-championship race was the 17th International Trophy at Silverstone. Graham Hill led at the start with John Surtees and Jackie Stewart close behind. But Hill retired with mechanical trouble and Jack Brabham took over until his car caught fire. The race developed into a battle between Stewart and Surtees. Stewart won by 3 seconds, his first international victory. Monaco fell on the same weekend as the Indianapolis 500, and as a result, neither Jim Clark nor Dan Gurney entered the race. Graham Hill led Jackie Stewart and the Ferraris of Lorenzo Bandini and John Surtees. On lap 25, Hill dropped to 5th, trying to lap Bob Anderson. Stewart led, but spun at Saint-Devote. Jack Brabham worked his way past the Ferraris, but went out with an engine failure, and so Bandini was in front. Richard Atwood put his Lotus into the chicane. Australia's Paul Hawkins did even better, putting his Lotus into the harbour before swimming to safety. While all this was going on, Hill passed Stewart and then Surtees. On lap 65, he passed Bandini, while Stewart closed on Surtees and took 3rd. Graham Hill scored his 3rd consecutive Monaco win. 2nd went to Bandini and 3rd to Stewart. Hill led the championship with 12 points. Jim Clark was second on 9, and Surtees was equal third with Bandini on 6 points. A day later, the focus switched across the Atlantic to Indianapolis.
The pace car pulls into the pit, and the race is on. Clark leads the pack through the first turn with A.J. Foyt, Dan Gurney, and Flannery Jones in close pursuit. Clark fans shout with excitement. The Flying Scout has passed Foyt to take back the lead. There's trouble in turn 3. Lloyd Ruby pits to replace tires flattened by the skid and returns to the race. A signal to Jim Clark brings him in for fuel. His crew of pit stop specialists, recruited from American stock car racing, have him rolling toward the track again in a fantastic time of 17 seconds. With Clark in the pits, A.J. Foyt has captured first place and leads the Scot by a few seconds. Jim McElreath nearly picks up a passenger when his engine stalls. Foyt coasts into the pits, out of fuel and his engine stopped. His crew refuels him and restarts the engine, but the long stop costs him dearly. Clark is far in the lead when Foyt returns to the track. Jones' pit crew is worried because he is running low on fuel, and Parnelli is worried because the threat of Andretti keeps him from slackening his pace to save fuel. A pit stop will surely cost him second place and $25,000. But if he runs out of gas before finishing, he loses everything. Jim Clark crosses the finish line to win the 500 with a comfortable lead of more than 2 minutes. It is the culmination of 3 years of effort by car builder Colin Chapman, and he dances down the pits like a ballet artist as Clark drives the triumphant road to victory lane. Jim Clark, first European to win at Indianapolis since 1916, set a new record of 150.686 miles per hour.
Returning to Grand Prix racing in Belgium, Graham Hill took pole, with Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart alongside on the front row. Richie Ginther put his Honda alongside Dan Gurney's Brabham on the second row, while world champion John Surtees was back on the third row with Rob Walker's drivers Joe Bonnier and Joe Siffert. It was raining heavily, and Hill took the lead from Clark, but the Lotus moved ahead on the run down to the Master Kink and soon pulled away. Hill was struggling with the BRM in the wet, and Stewart soon moved up to second place, while Surtees also overtook Hill, only to suffer an engine failure on lap 6. Richie Ginther finished 6th in the Honda. Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart lapped the entire field. Hill came under attack from Bruce McLaren's Cooper, and on lap 18 the New Zealander moved up to third. Richard Attwood looked to be on course for 7th when he spun into a telegraph pole. He was not seriously injured, but the car burst into flames and was badly damaged. In the closing laps, Hill would also fall victim to Jack Brabham. Jim Clark won the Belgian Grand Prix for the 4th successive year. Second was Jackie Stewart, and third Bruce McLaren. Clark's win put him in the lead for the World Championship with 18 points, ahead of Graham Hill on 15 and Jackie Stewart third with 11. Ford continued its concerted effort in the Le Mans 24-hour race, and Ferrari responded with factory and private entries. Quickest in practice was the Phil Hill Chris Amon Ford GT40. One of the privateer Ferrari 275 LMs of Maston Gregory, Jochen Rindt and Ed Hugus. The Fords took the lead at the start, but lost part of their advantage with frequent refueling. The weather was hot, and overheating began to hit the GT40s. Phil Hill's Ford went out of the race after completing 90 laps, but he broke the lap record 3 times. At 6 hours, the order was John Surtees and Mike Parks, Joe Bonnier and Lorenzo Bandini, and the Ford of Lucien Bianchi and Mike Salmon. But the P2 Ferraris began to suffer excessive brake wear, and the leading cars had stops to change discs, an operation that took 30 minutes. As the 275 LMs put less stress on the brakes, 2 of them were leading at 4 a.m. Pierre Dumais and Gustave Gosselin led the Nart entry of Maston Gregory, Jochen Rindt and Ed Hugus. The Rover BRM jet turbine car of Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart finished 10th. Destined to finish 3rd, the 250 LM of Willy Mairesi and Burleys. A class win to Linger and Knocker's 904 Porsche. Soon after 1 p.m, the Belgian Ferrari had a 1-minute lead over the American car, but Rindt was driving 12 seconds per lap faster. A close finish was expected. Then a tyre began to deflate on Dumais' car and soon disintegrated, destroying a large part of the thin aluminium rear bodywork. It took the Belgian crew 5 laps to have the car ready to rejoin the race. This was more than enough to give the victory to Rindt, Gregory and Hugus. Unfortunately, Ed Hugus was caught up in the crowd and didn't make it onto the podium. Despite the failure of Ferrari Works cars, this was the 9th victory for the prancing horse and their 6th in a row. However, this turned out to be Ferrari's last Le Mans win.
Of the world's best drivers and cars were on the grid at Clermont-Ferrand for the start of the French Grand Prix. Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead.
Jackie Stewart chased Clark for the rest of the race.
That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb. Reigning champ John Surtees, number 2, Ferrari.
Surtees overtook Dan Gurney for 3rd place.
Bandini's Ferrari skidded off the road here, closely followed by one of his wheels.
Jack Brabham decided to stand down to let Denny Hulme drive, and the New Zealander was up to 4th.
It was number 6, Jim Clark, all the way. Nobody could possibly catch him now.
Clark won easily from Jackie Stewart, with John Surtees 3rd.
Victory for Clark at 89.2 miles per hour, the fastest ever average over this switchback circuit. The Flying Scot now has a commanding lead in the current World Championship.
Clark was on 27 points and looking unbeatable. The 1965 British Grand Prix returned to Silverstone. Jim Clark was fastest in qualifying, sharing the front row with Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart, split by Richie Ginther's improving Honda. Last-minute adjustments for Dan Gurney's Brabham. John Surtees was driving the 1512 for the first time and shared row 2 with Lotus Mike Spence. Lorenzo Bandini in the second Ferrari, and Denny Hulme enjoying his opportunity. Bruce McLaren in his final season with Cooper, and young Austrian teammate Jochen Rindt. Innes Ireland takes the casual approach. Richie Ginther in the Honda left all the others behind through sheer speed at the start, but the Japanese car slipped back to fourth on the second lap when Hill and Surtees found a way past. Surtees came under pressure from Mike Spence, but managed to hold off the Lotus driver, while Stewart ran around in a solitary fifth place. In the closing laps, Clark's engine suffered from falling oil pressure and began to misfire. He'd been taking it very steadily around corners and making up his speed on the straights. Jochen Rindt walks in. Clark crossed the line just 3 seconds ahead of Hill to win his fourth consecutive British Grand Prix. The victory parade on the back of the Silverstone trailer. The win put Clark on 36 points with Graham Hill on 23. A week later was the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. Richie Ginther took pole position in the Honda, ahead of Jim Clark's Lotus and the BRM of Graham Hill. Colin Chapman and Jack Brabham compare notes. Once again, Jack was letting Denny Hulme take his seat. Dan Gurney's Brabham shared the second row with John Surtees' Ferrari, while the third row featured Mike Spence, Denny Hulme and Jackie Stewart. At the start, Richie Ginther held the lead with Hill second and Clark third. There was excitement off track when Colin Chapman was accused of assaulting a policeman. Just before the cars moved to the grid, Chapman ran back along the track to the pits and was involved in a fracas. It took Hill until the end of lap 2 to slipstream past the Honda. Clark passed Ginther at the end of the fourth lap. He then managed to get by Hill on lap 5. As Clark pulled away from Hill, Ginther dropped back. He was overtaken by Gurney, Stewart and then Hulme in the laps which followed. Hulme leads Ginther. Denny Hulme stopped to check his rear suspension, but was able to rejoin in front of the Honda. Things were calm in the Lotus pit. Hill began to drift back down the order, with Gurney and then Stewart passing him. Stewart was then able to overtake Gurney and move to second, but there was no way he could catch Clark. The increasingly competitive Honda team decided to miss the next race, the German Grand Prix, and make modifications to their car, returning for the Italian Grand Prix in mid-September. Out in front, Clark was controlling the race from Stewart and Gurney. And that's the way it finished. Second was Jackie Stewart, third Dan Gurney, while Graham Hill was fourth. Fifth was Denny Hulme, and Richie Ginther finally finished sixth. Of the 6 races so far, Clark had won 5 and didn't race in the other one at Monaco. By the German Grand Prix, John Surtees was about to be replaced as world champion. Bruce McLaren was making plans for his own team. Privateer Paul Hawkins was having another start. Jim Clark could secure the championship if he won the race. In qualifying, he was over 3 seconds a lap faster than his nearest challenger, Jackie Stewart. Another huge crowd of 300,000 watched Clark streak into the lead and remained there throughout the race. Hill was chasing with Stewart third. Clark broke the lap record 4 times. Stewart pushed too hard and went off at Wipperman and had to retire with a damaged suspension. John Surtees makes a stop. This put Gurney in third. Jim Clark won his 6th Grand Prix of the year and secured his 2nd World Championship. At Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, Ferrari had 3 cars for John Surtees, Lorenzo Bandini and Nino Vaccarella, as did Brabham for Dan Gurney, Denny Hulme and Giancarlo Baghetti. Clark took pole with Surtees alongside and Stewart completing the front row. Clark took the lead, with Stewart, Hill and Bandini chasing, while Surtees made a poor start and dropped right back. Clark, Stewart and Hill all took turns at leading as they slipstreamed each other, and they were soon joined by Surtees, who had recovered from his problems at the start. The revamped Honda retired. Having battled all the way with the 2 BRMs, Clark's race ended on lap 63 with a fuel pump failure. Surtees was also out. While there were meant to be team orders to slow down, the BRM drivers decided to race. Hill looked set for victory, but on the second last lap he made a mistake at the Parabolica and Stewart went into the lead. Stewart won his 1st Grand Prix victory in only his 8th World Championship event. Hill followed him home, an unhappy 2nd, while Dan Gurney came 3rd with Lorenzo Bandini 4th. With John Surtees absent due to a sports car crash and Clark and Stewart retiring, Graham Hill won the US Grand Prix. The final race of the 1.5-litre Formula saw the first win to Honda, Richie Ginther taking the honours to end the season. In a dominant performance, Jim Clark won the World Championship and the Indianapolis 500, and Lotus won the Constructors' Championship. He could afford to relax at the family farm in Berwickshire, Scotland. In 1966, there was a return to power with 3-litre engines. Would everything be so successful for Lotus and Jim Clark? In 1966, there was a return to power in Grand Prix racing. Jack Brabham was best prepared with his Repco-engined Brabhams dominating the season. More British drivers tried for the glittering rewards at the Indianapolis 500. And it was Ford's 3rd attempt at Le Mans. Would they succeed?
Track drivers started in the Pau Grand Prix. The round the houses circuit is tricky, including the outskirts of the town. Driving a Brabham Honda, number 8, Jack Brabham himself. Number 12, the formidable Graham Hill.
All the big names competed in Formula 2 races alongside up-and-coming drivers. Jack Brabham formed a partnership with Honda and won 10 of the 16 European Formula 2 races in 1966.
Brabham's tail, Dennis Hulme of New Zealand. Graham Hill in a Brabham BRM. Brabham won, beating the circuit record by 5 miles an hour at an average of 67.7.
The third round of the Sports Car World Championship was the Monza 1,000-kilometre race held in pouring rain. The opening 2 rounds at Daytona and Sebring had been won by Ford GTs, but this was Ferrari's home ground. Herbert Müller and Willy Mairesi's GT40 finished third. From the start, John Surtees and co-driver Mike Parks went into the lead in the 330 P3 Coupe. They qualified a full 10 seconds faster than Skip Scott's GT40. John Surtees had made a remarkable recovery from a serious crash in the Can-Am Series 7 months before. He'd suffered spinal injuries, a broken pelvis and a ruptured kidney. Surtees and Parks covered the 1,000 kilometres in 6 hours and 5 minutes at an average speed of 165 kilometres an hour in treacherous conditions. Second were Maston Gregory and Sir John Whitmore in their Ford GT40, 1 lap behind. But despite the celebrations, tensions were beginning to develop in the Ferrari camp.
In May 1966, Silverstone provided a preview in Britain of racing with the new Formula One cars up to 3 litres. Jack Brabham's car is an unknown quantity at this moment, but soon the Australian V8 engine is to make its presence felt in this highly specialised field of motor racing.
Ferrari with a V12, Cooper with a 1950s Maserati, and Brabham with the Australian-made Repco V8 were the only teams with 3-litre engines.
Jack is soon out in front with John Surtees in a V12 Ferrari on his tail, and the race develops into a duel between number 2 and number 4. But the Ferrari is not going to catch the Repco Brabham.
Despite Ferrari's confidence, it was the reliable, lightweight and economical Repco Brabham that led everyone home.
The Silverstone International Trophy is the first race in Britain of the new formula. And Jack wins this Grand Prix preview at an average speed of over 116 miles per hour.
The Formula One Championship began with the Monaco Grand Prix, the first of 9 rounds. BRM had a 2-litre engine, while Lotus relied on a stretched 2-litre Coventry Climax. At the start, Jim Clark had gearbox trouble, so John Surtees took the lead with Jackie Stewart and Graham Hill chasing. Clark battled through the field to 8th place. On lap 15, Surtees went out with a differential failure, leaving Jackie Stewart in the lead. Clark was up to 5th behind Stewart, Rindt, Bandini and Hill. On lap 60, Clark went out with a suspension failure, and Hill's hopes ended with a spin. He recovered to 3rd. That left Jackie Stewart to win by 40 seconds from Lorenzo Bandini. Stewart won at a record average speed. The lap record was lowered 10 times. 4th went to American Bob Bondurant in a private BRM, but he was 5 laps behind. The Indianapolis 500 saw defending champion Jim Clark joined by Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart, both driving Lolas. There was a spectacular pile-up, putting 14 cars out of action, including Dan Gurney. Amazingly, the only injury was a cut finger to AJ Foyt when he climbed the wire fence. Cars were driven for several laps in single file before the restart. After Mario Andretti was black flagged for leaking oil, Lloyd Ruby had the race under control. But Ruby was also black flagged while leading by almost a lap. Jim Clark spun, putting Jackie Stewart ahead. With 10 laps to go, Stewart's car lost oil pressure, and that put Graham Hill into the lead ahead of Jim Clark. Colin Chapman and sponsor Andy Grattinelli claimed that the stewards had miscounted Clark's laps and that in fact he was the winner. A Officials worked late into the night, checking lap recording tapes, and confirmed that Graham Hill had won. And as Graham said, he'd already drunk the traditional winner's bottle of milk. The Nürburgring 1000 saw an interesting car from the USA make its debut, the Chaparral 2D of Phil Hill and Joe Bonnier. Phil Hill had retired from Grand Prix racing and was concentrating on sports cars. John Surtees and Mike Parkes were again sharing the P3 that had won at Monza and then in Belgium. They qualified first, with the Hill-Bonnier Chaparral second. With its automatic transmission, fiberglass construction, Chevrolet engine and backdoor GM support, the Chaparral was an unknown quantity. Surtees and Parkes set the early pace. End of the road for the Fritz Juttner Klaus Steinmetz Abarth 1300. Joe Schlesser and Guy Ligier's Ford GT40 was fifth. When the Surtees-Parkes Ferrari retired with a burnt-out clutch on lap 35, the Chaparral took the lead. Phil Hill risked a long stop in the pits to change all four tyres, but he brought the 2D to its maiden European win. Hill and Bonnier beat Dino Ferraris driven by Ludovico Scarfiotti and Lorenzo Bandini, and Pedro Rodriguez and Richie Ginther. For the Belgian Grand Prix, the first new Lotus BRM 43 appeared in the hands of Peter Arundel, but Jim Clark stayed with his 2-litre Lotus Climax. John Surtees was fastest in practice by 3 seconds in his Ferrari, with Jackie Stewart and Jochen Rindt alongside. The weather was threatening as the cars set off, with John Surtees leading Jochen Rindt through Eau Rouge. At Bernville on the opening lap, the field ran into a heavy rainstorm. Joe Bonnier, Mike Spence, Joe Siffert and Denny Hulme all went off. Jochen Rindt had a spin at the master kink, then Stewart, Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant lost control at the same place. Bondurant's car rolled, but he escaped with cuts and bruises. Hill stopped to try and help Stewart, who was trapped in his BRM, covered with petrol and suffering from a broken shoulder, a cracked rib and internal bruising. Scott was taken to the medical centre in the back of a truck, something that left a lasting memory and drove his crusade for safer circuits. With the accidents and Jim Clark's retirement, there were only 7 cars left. Dan Gurney had joined the championship with the Climax-engined Eagle. Jochen Rindt's Cooper Maserati took the lead on lap 4 and stayed in front for the next 20 laps until it had to slow down with a troublesome engine. John Surtees, 100 metres behind in his wake, overtook the Austrian to win. Rindt was second, while Bandini finished third, a lap down, with Jack Brabham fourth and Richie Ginther fifth. After 2 rounds, Lorenzo Bandini led the World Championship. "60 cars lined up at Le Mans, and Ford was desperate to break Ferrari's 6-year reign. 8 works-backed Ford GT Mark IIs were lined up against 14 Ferraris. But Ferrari had lost their best driver, John Surtees, before the race had even started. After ill-feeling that had been brewing for months with team manager Eugenio Dragoni, the 1964 champion left the team he'd helped to revive. At 1:45 in the morning, the Ferrari P2s had already exhausted their engines trying to stay in front of the Fords. The last Ferrari prototype, the Pedro Rodriguez Richie Ginther P3, retired with overheating. The race was won for Ford. The question was, which Ford? The leading car of Ken Miles and Denny Hulme in the pits. Expatriate Englishman Miles was the chief test driver for the Ford GT project and had already won at Daytona and Sebring. The sister car of Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon was on the same lap as the race drew to a close. 12 laps adrift was the number 5 entry of Bucknam and Hutchison. Ford tried to stage a dead heat at the finish between the Miles-Hulme and McLaren-Amon cars, but as the flag waved and the cars trickled across the line, Bruce McLaren was a few metres ahead. It was a bitter disappointment for Ken Miles, who believed he should have won. Tragically, he died later in the year testing for Ford.
The start of the greatest success story in the history of international motor racing. The location, Reims, France, and the race, the French Grand Prix and Grand Prix of Europe, in which the Repco Brabhams will set up the fastest average speed ever achieved in a Grand Prix race. Jack, driving number 12, is the first driver ever to win a world title event in a car of his own construction. His average speed for the race is nearly 137 miles per hour. His teammate Denny Hulme, also driving a Repco Brabham, was third.
Jack Brabham scored the historic first Grand Prix win for a driver in his own car and also took the World Championship lead.
Fastest lap in practice has given Jack pole position on the grid, and he keeps in front right from the start. Jack has fitted tyres for dry weather in spite of rain, and his gamble pays off.
It had rained before the race, but the track soon began to dry. John Surtees was now with Cooper, but there was no sign of Ferrari, the Italian team plagued by strikes in Italy.
John Surtees driving a Cooper Maserati.
Denny Hulme moved up to second place.
World champion Jim Clark driving a Lotus Climax.
Clark had to pull in to repair his brakes. He rejoined and passed Surtees and Rindt.
Graham Hill in a BRN duels with Clark. But none of them can catch the Repco Brabham. Denny Hulme is chasing Graham Hill and eventually passes him. After earlier wet conditions, the track is drying out to give the Repco Brabham team an advantage. In this race, Jack is proving that he's not too old at 40. He's led from start to finish to win at an average speed of 95.49 miles per hour, with Denny Hulme second. Jack's Repco Brabham has lapped every other car in the race, except Denny's.
It was a dominant showing by the Repco Brabham team, and Jack extended his points lead over Lorenzo Bandini. Next was the Dutch Grand Prix, with Jack Brabham again on pole. In a rare extrovert moment, 40-year-old Jack donned a beard and walking stick on the grid.
Jack, number 16, forges ahead of Jim Clark, who was soon troubled with a hot engine. Jack's Repco Brabham is performing beautifully. He's maintaining a steady pressure and is well on the way to achieving his third consecutive Grand Prix victory.
When Brabham came up to lap back markers on lap 27, he was balked, and Clark found a way into the lead, and the Lotus driver began to pull away until he began to suffer serious vibration problems with the engine. This led to a water pump fracturing, and on lap 76, Brabham was able to get back into the lead. Clark pitted to get more water and then fell behind Hill and was only just clear of fourth place Stewart when they crossed the finishing line. Brabham had by then lapped the entire field.
Denny Hulme retires shortly with ignition trouble after an excellent performance. And Jack wins with an average speed of 100.09 miles per hour. A remarkable series of wins. Jim Clark had won this race for the previous 3 years.
Brabham increased his lead to 16 points over Graham Hill.
Now the German Grand Prix. 14 miles of ups and downs over the grueling Nürburgring. Jack number 3 has planned for rain and has fitted wet weather tyres, and once again his gamble pays off. John Surtees is a serious challenger, but clutch trouble will spoil his chances before the race is finished.
By the end of the first lap, Brabham had taken the lead from Surtees, with Rindt getting ahead of Bandini into third. Denny Hulme had ignition problems and retired.
The cars race in a cloud of spray, very difficult conditions that tax drivers and machines to the utmost. And it's Jack's race, making 4 in a row.
Brabham's win virtually ensured his World Championship. John Surtees now had to win the remaining 3 races. At Monza, Honda appeared for the first time, with Richie Ginther driving the new Honda V12, and Dan Gurney making his first appearance with the Westlake V12 in his Eagle. BRM and Lotus fitted their cars with the complex BRM H16 engine. Pole position went to Ferrari's Mike Parks, Ludovico Scarfiotti second and Jim Clark third. Parks, Surtees and then Brabham led until Jack went out with an oil leak after 8 laps. Scarfiotti was able to get ahead of the slipstreaming battle. On lap 17, Ginther had a tyre failure in the Curva Grande and his Honda crashed into trees. The American was unhurt, but the new car was destroyed. Scarfiotti was now ahead of Hulme, Parks and Surtees. On lap 32, Surtees went into the pits to retire with a fuel leak, meaning that Jack Brabham confirmed his World Championship. Scarfiotti finished 6 seconds clear of the battle for second, the first Italian to win the race in 14 years. Mike Parks was just ahead of Denny Hulme, with Rindt a distant 4th. The US Grand Prix saw Jim Clark's only win of the year, and the first and only for the H16 BRM engine. And finally, John Surtees won the Mexican Grand Prix from Jack Brabham.
In London, the British Automobile Racing Club honours Jack with a dinner. Graham Hill and Jim Clark are among the personalities present. Jack and his wife are welcomed by the Duke and Duchess of Richmond and Gordon. Jack receives the club's gold medal for his unique double, the manufacturers' and drivers' titles. Jack has also been invested with the OBE by the Queen of England during this fantastic year.
To win the World Drivers' and Constructors' Championships was a truly remarkable performance by the Anglo-Australian team, who were better prepared than all the others. Neil Mallard spoke to Jack Brabham at the end of the season.
Well, the highlight of your season this year has been your partnership with Danny Hulme of New Zealand. Do you think the same partnership's going on next year?
I can't confirm that, but I really do think so.
Who do you see as your strongest challenge next year for the world title?
I would say Jim Clark would probably be the biggest threat next year, because the new Ford engine is being built under similar lines to our own as far as weight and size is concerned, and Jim Clark at the wheel as well, of course. This is going to be really the opposition, but there are plenty of other people going to give us opposition as well, such as Dan Gurney's team. This particular car looks very good.
Jack, you've won the World Championship, swept the board in Formula 2, and your cars are walking away with Formula 3. Most people would say, we'll follow that. Well, how are you going to follow it?
Well, we're going to try and achieve the same result again if we can next year. A lot of people thought there was probably a fluke this year, so we're going to try and make sure that we can do it again next year.
Now, Fangio retired at 47 with 5 world championships under his belt. You're going to try and beat him?
No, this isn't any ambition of mine at all, actually. I enjoy winning world championships, mind you, but I never look at that as being a goal.
But you're not thinking of retiring for some time yet?
No, I don't intend retiring before next year anyway.
The 13th Macau Grand Prix drew the best drivers to the Portuguese colony from across Asia. 29 cars got away to a good start, and as they rounded Yacht Club Bend for the first time, it was Philippe Nogueira who took an early lead, closely followed by Belgian Mauro Bianchi in the Renault Alpine number 6. Nogueira wasn't destined to stay in the race for very long. That initial burst of speed had overstrained the engine, and after one lap of glory, he was out of the race, having come all the way from Portugal for the occasion. That left Mauro Bianchi in the lead, which he held for the rest of the race. 1964 winner Albert Poon and Shintaro Taki of Japan in his Porsche Carrera battled for second and third. After a late pit stop, Mauro Bianchi was back in the lead and went on to win the race. Bianchi was the younger brother of Lucien Bianchi. The winning car was the 1298cc Renault Alpine Sports. The season ended with the RAC Rally in Britain, a marathon event using forest roads. Jim Clark had his Lotus Cortina up to 6th until he crashed out. Graham Hill in a Mini Cooper retired from the rally near Carlisle with gearbox trouble. Timo Mäkinen led in his Mini, but was passed by the Lotus Cortina of Bent Söderström and Gunnar Palm. Mäkinen's Cooper had gearbox trouble. 1967 looked like an exciting year ahead for motorsport on the tracks and in the forests. In 1967, Formula One was hotting up. Could Jack Brabham retain his championship, or would the new Ford Cosworth-powered Lotus of Jim Clark be a winner? Other drivers too were ready to step up. And Ford was taking the sledgehammer approach to Le Mans once again. Formula One season opened with the South African Grand Prix at the new Kyalami circuit near Johannesburg. Team Lotus recruited Graham Hill to join Jim Clark, John Surtees having been hired to drive for Honda. Rhodesian privateer John Love had an old Cooper Climax. Jack Brabham and Denny Hulme lined up 1-2 on the grid, with Clark and Cooper's Pedro Rodriguez on the second row. Hulme took the lead with Brabham and Surtees giving chase. On the third lap, Brabham made a mistake and spun and dropped to fourth. Hulme now led, with Surtees gradually being caught by Brabham. The Australian took second on lap 21 with Rindt following. Rindt's race ended with an engine failure, but by then Surtees had dropped behind John Love and Dan Gurney. Brabham retired with a misfiring engine, which promoted Love to second and Gurney to third, but the American went out with suspension failure. On lap 61, Hulme's brakes failed. Remarkably, this put Love into the lead, but with only 6 laps to go, he had to stop for more fuel, and Pedro Rodriguez took the lead to win his first Grand Prix. Love was a splendid second, Surtees third, with Hulme fourth. The Monte Carlo rally saw a variety of cars tackle the famous Alpine stages. Front-wheel drive Minis took on rear-engined Porsches and conventional Lancias. Finland's Rauno Aaltonen and his British co-driver Henry Liddon in a Mini Cooper were trading stage times with the Lancia Fulvia of Ove Anderson and John Davenport and the Porsche 911 of Vic Elford and David Stone. The team prize went to Renault. Aaltonen took victory on the final night's speed test over snow-covered roads in the mountains above Monaco. The 28-year-old's winning margin was under 12 seconds, one of the closest finishes in the rally's long history. All the big names were at Brands Hatch for the Race of Champions, and it was the chance for teams to debut their 1967 cars. Dan Gurney won the two 10-lap preliminary races in the Eagle Westlake. He lined up alongside Jack Brabham and Ferrari's Lorenzo Bandini in the 40-lap final. Jack Brabham had a furious battle with Gurney until the Australian fell back with ignition trouble. Gurney's teammate Richie Ginther dropped from 2nd to 6th place with steering trouble. Gurney was then challenged by Bandini, but the American held on by 0.4 of a second. Joe Siffert was third in a Cooper Maserati. The signs were good for the Anglo-American racers. In Monaco, Denny Hulme scored his first Grand Prix win, although tragically Lorenzo Bandini lost his life after a fiery crash when his Ferrari hit hay bales at the chicane and rolled over.
Zandvoort. Jack Brabham, all set in his Repco Brabham for the Dutch Grand Prix. Driving a Honda, John Surtees. 17 cars lined up. Back in the third row, Jim Clark, his first time out in a remarkable new Lotus Ford.
Lotus debuted the 49, with the Ford-financed, Cosworth-built DFE bolted onto the monocoque.
90 laps of the circuit, 235 miles in all. Clark biding his time. John Surtees. Dennis Hume. Chris Irwin. Graham Hill had to retire with engine trouble. With Graham Hill out of the running, Clark took the lead. At an average of 104.4, a great triumph for an untried car, Jim Clark won the Dutch Grand Prix for the 4th time.
Denny Hulme continued to lead the World Championship. Fresh from winning the Indianapolis 500, A.J. Foyt was one of many American speedway racers recruited by Ford to race at Le Mans. He was paired with Dan Gurney. There were a total of 8 of the latest Mark IV GT40s. Chief opposition was the factory Ferrari 330 P4 of Mike Parks and Ludovico Scarfiotti, backed up by private entries. Lola was there with Aston Martin-powered T70s, but they had a short race. Mike Spence and Phil Hill in the high-winged Chaparral 2E were running a strong second until the Chaparral's automatic transmission broke down. Foyt and Gurney in the red number 1 Ford took the lead after 90 minutes. It was Gurney's 7th attempt at Le Mans, and he had eventually worked out that you really do have to pace yourself and the car to have the best chance of success. Gurney and Foyt led from the second hour to the end of the event. Henry Ford II was there to watch. In a celebrated incident which took place in the middle of the night, Gurney had been running quite easily to preserve his car, and second-placed Mike Parks came up behind in the Ferrari P4, which was trailing by 4 laps. For several laps, Parks hounded the Ford driver by flashing his lights in Gurney's mirrors, until an exasperated Gurney pulled off the course at Arnage and stopped on a grassy verge. Parks stopped behind him, and the 2 leading cars at Le Mans 1967 sat there in the dark, motionless, until Parks finally realized this attempt at provocation was not going to work. After a few moments, he pulled around Gurney and resumed the race, with Gurney following shortly after. A multiple crash put out 3 of the Fords during the night when they were lying 2nd, 6th and 9th. This left the Gurney Foyt and the Bruce McLaren Mark Donoghue cars as the only Fords left. Damage to the McLaren Donoghue GT40, but after repairs they reached the finish in 4th place. The experienced Dan Gurney matched his pace against the slower Foyt, and in doing so they both drove within the car's limits. The winning car of Gurney and Foyt covered a record distance of 5,232 kilometres at an average speed of over 200 kilometres an hour. Ludovico Scarfiotti and Mike Parks finished 2nd, and an Équipe Nationale Belge P4 of Willy Marécy and Jean Berlis was 3rd. This was the last year of the big 7-litre prototypes. 32-year-old A.J. Foyt, competing at Le Mans for the first time, became the only man to have won Le Mans and the Indianapolis 500, and it was all in the space of 2 weeks. Jim Clark was on pole in Belgium by 3 seconds. Dan Gurney, fresh from his Le Mans win, was 2nd with Graham Hill 3rd. While Clark took the lead, Hill failed to make the start because of a flat battery and had to set off from the pits a long way behind. Gurney tried to make the start without putting his car in gear, so Rindt, Stewart and Parks sped past. Towards the end of the first lap, Mike Parks slid on some oil from Stewart's BRM and crashed at high speed at Blanchimont. He suffered a broken leg and wrist and a head injury which ended his Formula One career. At the end of lap 12, Clark pitted. He had his plugs changed and rejoined in 7th place. Jackie Stewart had gear selection problems. He had to drive one-handed, using the other to hold the gear lever in place. On lap 21, Dan Gurney took the lead and he went on to win by over a minute. It would be Eagle's one and only Grand Prix victory. Stewart finished 2nd with Eamon 3rd. A great week for Dan, only the 2nd driver constructor to win a Grand Prix. Denny Hulme didn't finish but continued to lead the championship. The new Bugatti circuit at Le Mans hosted the French Grand Prix. Graham Hill took pole, with Jack Brabham and Dan Gurney alongside. Hill took the lead with Gurney, Brabham, Clark and Eamon chasing. Brabham drove a brilliant race. He was always among the leaders and hit the front after Jim Clark and Graham Hill were forced out with mechanical trouble. The Lotus Fords couldn't match the Repco Brabham's reliability and consistency. Brabham's win lifted him to 2nd in the championship on 16 points behind Hulme on 22.
Silverstone, early. The heat just starting to build up. In the paddock, empty transporters. Their thoroughbred loads and special tyres waiting for the action. This was the scene before the British Grand Prix, the time when drivers and mechanics try to relax. finding things to do that have already been done. Graham Hill back in business with a rebuilt Lotus after his crash the day before, one of the heroes of the meeting. And as final preparations for the race were made, 130,000 enthusiasts streamed into the Grand Prix circuit. A lot of them after autographs. In demand, Jack Brabham. Jackie Stewart, and close by, Denny Hulme, the leading championship driver, his Brabham Repco getting plenty of attention. Hulme Jr. couldn't care less. While he slept, the temperature climbed towards the 80s. Drivers like Mike Spence did their best to relax. Dan Gurney took it easy in a shady place. But for others, there was work to do. Hill, anxious about his untried car, worked alongside Lotus mechanics on the big Ford engine. No time for distraction. The same for John Surtees, driving a Japanese-entered Honda. Starting time near. The cars were going out onto the track. In the Honda camp, last-minute adjustments. Jim Clark looking cool and calm, but perhaps wondering how his Lotus teammate's car would stand up to the high-speed hammering it would face. But Graham Hill seemed happy enough. Lotus boss Colin Chapman wasn't so sure. Only time would tell. Well, this was it. This was what the crowds had come to see. In blistering heat, the big names of motor racing lined up. Clark number 5, Hill number 6. Rolling from the dummy grid to action stations. All set. Firemen included. Into the lead from the start went Jim Clark. Close behind were Jack Brabham and Graham Hill. In tremendous heat that made the track shimmer, a ding-dong battle for position forced the speed up. It was too hot a pace for some, even early on. Time for Mike Spence to have a quick breather in the pits. Not that he wanted one, the race was unwinding fast. The car's getting further away from him. Nothing much he could do about it. Pit signals meant trouble for some, but for most, there were 80 grueling laps following Jim Clark. The beginning of the end for Graham Hill. Suspension trouble when in the lead. They fixed it, but Clark regained the lead and Hill eventually had to retire with engine trouble. The field was clear for the Flying Scotsman to open the gap between himself and the rest. First, Jim Clark, 1 hour, 59 minutes, 25.6 seconds. Denny Hulme second, Chris Amon third. But here was the man who'd fought his duel in the sun and won. For Jim Clark, victory. For the crowd, excitement, a heat wave, and a great British Grand Prix.
Clark put himself in the reckoning for the title with a victory which moved him up to equal second with Jack Brabham, 9 points behind Denny Hulme. For the German Grand Prix, Jim Clark was fastest in qualifying by nearly 10 seconds from Denny Hulme. Third fastest, amazingly, was set by Jackie Ickx in a Formula 2 Matra. Clark took the lead while Graham Hill was pushed onto the verge and spun, restarting at the back of the field. The Lola BMW of Hubert Hahne. Jim Clark kept ahead of Hulme and Dan Gurney for the first 3 laps, but on the 4th he slowed dramatically, his suspension having buckled. Once again, the reliability and integrity of the Lotus design was under question. The 49 was fast, but too fragile on challenging circuits like the Nürburgring. Dan Gurney took the lead from Hulme, while Brabham was third after McLaren went out with a split oil pipe. Jackie Ickx continued to impress by running fifth on the road behind Jackie Stewart. Ickx retired when his front suspension collapsed, but he'd made such an impression that he was signed for Ferrari in 1968. With 3 laps to go, Gurney suffered a drive shaft failure and Hulme took the lead to win from Brabham and Amon. Denny Hulme was closing in on the World Championship and was relaxed about his results.
I think each year I get better. It's easier to do what I'm doing. I don't have to think or concentrate as hard, and therefore you're much more relaxed, and I think this is the reason things are going a lot better this year.
The first Canadian Grand Prix was held at Mosport Park. Jim Clark and Graham Hill shared the front row with championship leader Denny Hulme. It was raining when the race began, and Clark took the lead with Hulme chasing. Clark stayed ahead until lap 68 when his engine cut out to the disgust of the Lotus crew. Brabham then passed Hulme to win the race with Gurney a long way back in third place. Jack's 9 points gave him a total of 34, 9 behind Hulme with 3 races to go. Graham Hill had done the majority of the development work on the Lotus because Jim Clark had been living in France as a tax exile. For the Italian Grand Prix, John Surtees debuted the new Honda RA300 based on the Indianapolis winning Lola, and Cooper gave Jackie Ickx a drive. In a fabulous slipstreaming race, Jim Clark led but had to stop for a flat tyre. He managed to make up a complete lap on the field and retake the lead, only for a fuel pump to fail. On the last lap, Jack Brabham and John Surtees were side by side into the Parabolica. Jack slithered through on the dusty inside part of the track and ran wide. John nipped through, and as they flashed across the line, Surtees had scored a memorable win. Always popular in Italy, the Tifosi joined Surtees' celebrations. Repco Brabham had won a second consecutive constructors' title, and only Jack or Denny could win the drivers' title. In the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, the Lotuses were again up front. Hill took the lead with Clark giving chase, but Gurney was soon up into second and stayed there until the end of the 8th lap when Clark reasserted himself. Hulme had got the better of Brabham, who was running 4th. Up at the front, Clark overtook Hill, who was having gearbox trouble, for the lead on lap 41. Brabham dropped back with a puncture. By now, the Lotus had found reliability with the Cosworth engine. Surtees spins the Honda. Amon and Hill fought over second place until lap 85 when Amon's engine failed. With 2 laps to go, Clark's suspension suddenly bent alarmingly, but he was able to keep the car going to grab victory by 6 seconds from Hill and Hulme. The extrovert Colin Chapman celebrated Clark's win, with Walter Hayes, the man who gave the DFV project the go-ahead. While Jim Clark collected the winner's garland, Denny Hulme extended his lead in the World Championship to 5 points over Jack Brabham. Mexico City, and either Denny Hulme or Jack Brabham could win the championship. The start saw Gurney run into the back of Clark, but the Lotus went away with only a bent exhaust, while Gurney retired after a few laps with a damaged radiator. All Hulme had to do was to keep his team leader in sight and not make a mistake. Clark soon passed Chris Amon. After that, he was able to dominate the race despite not having a clutch. Hill went out with drive shaft failure on lap 18, so third place went to Brabham, but he had Hulme behind him in a championship-winning position. Amon remained in second until the final few laps, when his Ferrari began to misfire, allowing Brabham, Hulme and Surtees past. Jim Clark won the race, but it was the dogged and determined Denny Hulme who won the World Championship, showing the way home to his boss. For 1968, Hulme decided to join fellow Kiwi Bruce McLaren as the DFE engine became more widely available. It promised to be a most competitive year. '68 was a pivotal year in motor racing. It showed the brutal human cost of the sport, with Jim Clark and 3 other Grand Prix drivers losing their lives during the season. On the sporting side, Graham Hill stepped up to the challenge offered by Jackie Stewart in the new Matra. And defending world champion Denny Hulme, now with McLaren. Le Mans was a Ford GT40 versus Porsche 908 race.
Number 9 was the number to watch. The British car speeding round the clock towards a terrific victory.
The World Championship began on New Year's Day with the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami. Locals like Sam Tingle joined newcomer Jean-Pierre Beltoise, who was driving for Matra. Jackie Stewart left BRM and joined the Ken Tyrrell run Matra International. Denny Hulme joined McLaren and was replaced at Brabham by Jochen Rindt. Jim Clark and Graham Hill in the Lotus 49s qualified on the front row. Jackie Stewart in the DFV-powered Matra led through the first corner. Hill dropped back to 7th behind Rindt, Surtees, Brabham and Amon. New Ferrari driver Jackie Ickx spun out in the early laps. On the second lap, Jim Clark took the lead and was never headed. On lap 7, Brabham passed Rindt for third, but then had engine trouble and dropped back. Rindt came under pressure from Hill, and on lap 13, the Englishman moved into third. Hill caught Stewart, and on lap 27, he moved into second. Stewart retired on lap 43 with engine failure. In the intense heat, fewer than half the cars finished the race. Clark crossed the line 23 seconds ahead of Graham Hill, with Jochen Rindt third in the Repco Brabham, Chris Amon fourth, Denny Hulme fifth in the McLaren BRM, and Jean-Pierre Beltoise sixth. In winning the South African Grand Prix, Jim Clark scored his 25th victory to beat the 24 wins set by Juan Manuel Fangio. The Monte Carlo rally was a Porsche Mini Cooper duel. 1967 winner Rauno Aaltonen was third. Second was 1966 winner Pauli Toivonen of Finland. Britain's Vic Elford and co-driver David Stone won the rally. Unluckiest driver was Gérard Larousse, who was leading halfway through the final stage until he ran off the road. Many of the top drivers competed in the 8-round Tasman Series, and the highlight was a fantastic race between Chris Amon in the Dino-powered Ferrari against the Lotus 49T of Jim Clark at Sandown for the Australian Grand Prix. With the crowd on its feet, Amon challenged Clark all the way to the flag, with only inches separating them. It turned out to be Jim Clark's last win. Tragedy struck in a minor Formula 2 race at Hockenheim in Germany, when Jim Clark's Lotus skidded off the track and somersaulted into trees at high speed. The crowd gasped when told over loudspeakers of the death of the 32-year-old Scottish farmer, who was world champion in 1963 and 1965 and won a record 25 Grand Prix. The Sports Car World Championship saw an increased presence from Porsche and smaller entries from Ferrari and Ford. Prototypes were limited to 5-litre engines, and the big American Ford effort was over. Instead, the GT40s were run by Britain's John Wyer. Porsches won the first 2 rounds at Daytona and Sebring, and Ford the third at Brands Hatch. For the opening 27 laps, the Ford GT40 of Jackie Ickx and Brian Redman led the pack, but exhaust troubles forced them into the pits. Olympic ski champion Jean-Claude Killy was sharing a works Porsche 911T with former Le Mans winner Jean Guichet. Joe Siffert and Hans Hermann's 908 had a smoking engine. On the banking, the Ludovico Scarfiotti Gerhard Mitter 908. With smaller engines, the Porsches were always facing a struggle on high-speed circuits like Monza, although their cars were much lighter than the GT40s. Jean-Claude Killy and Jean Guichet came in 10th overall and 2nd in the GT class. In the end, it was the Anglo-Australian pairing of David Hobbs and Paul Hawkins who emerged as the winners, averaging 190 kilometres per hour. Rolf Stommelen and Jochen Neerpasch in a Porsche 907 were second. There were only 13 cars on the grid for the Spanish Grand Prix at the new Jarama circuit near Madrid. BRM's Mike Spence had died in a practice crash at Indianapolis, while Jackie Stewart broke his wrist in a Formula 2 race. Lotus had 1 car for Graham Hill, now in the gold leaf colours. Chris Amon had pole with Pedro Rodriguez in the BRM, and Denny Hulme in the new DFE-powered McLaren M7 completing the first row. Rodriguez initially took the lead from Beltoise, Amon and Hulme. When Beltoise retired, Amon took over. Graham Hill was up to 4th. John Surtees in the updated Honda RA301. Chris Amon was holding the gap to Pedro Rodriguez. The Mexican's new V12-powered P126 was BRM's sole entry. On lap 27, Pedro Rodriguez lost control on a patch of oil, and his BRM hurtled off the track into the new-style safety netting. This put Graham Hill into 2nd with Hulme 3rd. On lap 58, Amon's fuel pump failed, so Hill took the lead. In the face of the setbacks that Lotus had suffered, Graham led by example and gave the team hope with a determined performance. Hill finished 16 seconds ahead of Denny Hulme, with Brian Redman 3rd for Cooper. Hill was on 15 championship points, with the late Jim Clark on 9 and Denny Hulme 8. Ferrari didn't attend the Monaco Grand Prix, and Jackie Stewart was still out of action. Qualifying saw Monaco master Graham Hill on pole, with Formula 1 debutant Johnny Servoz-Gavin impressively alongside in the Matra. Dan Gurney jetted in after Indianapolis qualifying, and Juan Manuel Fangio was having a look at the current Formula 1 scene. Servoz-Gavin took the lead, but after 3 laps he suffered a drive shaft failure and crashed, which left Hill in front. Jackie Oliver and Bruce McLaren collided on the opening lap, while Joe Siffert pushed his Rob Walker Lotus in. Hill led Beltoise and Surtees, Rindt Brabham and Richard Atwood's BRM. Jochen Rindt crashed. Jean-Pierre Beltoise broke his suspension on the curbs, and Piers Courage stopped because his BRM was handling so badly. John Surtees disappeared with a gearbox failure, and Pedro Rodriguez crashed, so only 5 cars were left by the end of lap 16. Running third was Belgian Lucien Bianchi in the Cooper, now powered by a BRM V12 rather than the aging Maserati. Denny Hulme stopped mid-race to have a drive shaft replaced and dropped to fifth. Dan Gurney was out with ignition trouble on lap 9. An inspired Dickie Atwood gave Hill a tremendous fight, especially in the last lap when he set a lap record, finishing just 2.2 seconds behind. Lucien Bianchi was third for Cooper. It was Graham Hill's fourth Monaco win. Hill now had 24 World Championship points. His nearest rival Denny Hulme was on 10. Ferrari returned for the Belgian Grand Prix after missing Monaco, their 312s now sporting aerofoils. Brian Redman was driving for Cooper in the place of Ludovico Scarfiotti. Jackie Stewart was back, his wrist strapped after a fracture 2 months ago. Jackie Ickx's Ferrari qualified on pole with Surtees and Amon alongside. Surtees was bogged down at the start but quickly made up ground. The race was a series of surprises. John Surtees in the Honda broke away from the Ferraris of Jackie Ickx and Chris Amon. Surtees broke the lap record, clocking 241 kilometers an hour. Joe Siffert in the Lotus 49. At the end of lap 7, Surtees led Chris Amon, who limped into the pits with oil pouring from his engine. Surtees' lead was short-lived. He retired with suspension sagging. Championship leader Graham Hill also retired. The race developed into a duel between Denny Hulme and Jackie Stewart. Brian Redman's Cooper had suspension failure, sending him over the fence. Tragically, the driver he was replacing, Ludovico Scarfiotti, had died the day before at the Rossfield Hill climb. On lap 16, Hulme joined the growing list of steaming cars in the pits, cruising in with a damaged drive shaft. Stewart had to top up the fuel 1 lap before the checkered flag, dropping to fourth. That left Bruce McLaren to take his first and what turned out to be only Grand Prix win as a manufacturer.
The start of the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. The weather was threatening, and before the 234-mile race was over, proved that it wasn't an empty threat. The top names in motor racing were competing in this major event. Chris Amon at the wheel of a Ferrari. Driving a Lotus Ford, Graham Hill. Parts of the circuit were flooded, forcing reduced speed and creating a vision blanket of spread. But already well clear in the lead was Britain's Jackie Stewart. British driver Jackie Oliver won the battle to keep his Lotus Ford on the track under treacherous conditions. It rained like it would never stop, but the crowd knew it was watching great racing as Jackie Stewart opened up his lead to take the checkered flag in his Matra Ford a lap ahead of the rest. The win put him second in the champion driver stakes.
Graham Hill didn't score any points in Holland, having spun out of the race. In the French Grand Prix at Rouen, Jochen Rindt set the fastest practice time in his Repco Brabham, with Jackie Stewart's Matra Ford and Jackie Ickx's Ferrari sharing the front row. Championship leader Graham Hill was only 9th. Light rain was falling, but most drivers started on intermediate tyres. The exception was Ickx, who chose full wets. As a result, he was leading at the end of the first lap. Stewart and Rindt were battling over second place, with Surtees 4th. Jean-Pierre Beltoise in the Matra with the French company's own V12. Pedro Rodriguez at the hairpin on the public road course. Vic Elford was recruited by Cooper to replace Brian Redman. Jean-Pierre Beltoise finished 9th. Denny Hulme leads Piers Courage in the BRM. Elford, who had won the Monte Carlo rally in January, led BRM's Richard Atwood. On lap 3, Frenchman Joe Schlesser, driving a new air-cooled, magnesium-chassied Honda RA302, crashed on the high-speed sweepers. Schlesser was pulled from the blazing wreck, but died soon afterwards. 5 spectators were also slightly burned. Nothing was left of the car. The race went on. Jackie Ickx scored his first victory in only his 9th Grand Prix. Surtees was second in the conventional Honda. Third place went to Stewart, with versatile Vic Elford 4th on his Grand Prix debut for Cooper.
Brands Hatch, the ascot of British motor racing. The Carnaby Street influence was certainly in evidence on the day of the British Grand Prix. So too was the royal influence. Chatting with the speed men on the starting grid was Prince Charles. And what a lineup of track aces there were for this major championship event. Vic Elford, Jack Brabham, Denny Hulme, John Surtees, Jackie Stewart, and Jackie Ickx. The seconds wound down before the start. 24 drivers stamped hard on the throttle. America's Dan Gurney hit trouble on the grid. Before he'd sorted it out, the rest of the racers were well into the first of the 80 laps. Into Paddock Bend. Graham Hill, 8, and Jackie Oliver, 9, led the way in their Lotus Fords. But number 22, Joe Siffert, driving a Rob Walker-entered Lotus Ford, was with them. The pace being set was cracking hot. Graham Hill had turned in a terrific practice lap speed and was hell bent on a win. His hopes were shattered on the 26th lap when a wrecked drive shaft joint put him out of the race. Not even the miracle-working pit mechanics could pull one out of the bag this time. Graham Hill joined the spectators watching the exciting battle of the leaders. Siffert was out in front. Oliver had retired. Now only Chris Amon and Jackie Ickx were in the tussle. The speeding Swiss, Joe Siffert, was streaking ahead to a record-breaking British Grand Prix win, 4 seconds ahead of Chris Amon. He took the checkered flag after completing the 212 miles in 2 hours, 1 minute and 20 seconds, an average of 104.83 miles per hour. Earl Mountbatten presented the sporting Swiss driver with a magnificent trophy. Siffert, the man from the neutral peace-loving nation, had driven to a superb win.
Siffert gave team patron Rob Walker his first World Championship victory in 7 years.
Nürburgring. In atrocious conditions, the German Grand Prix got underway. Dense fog and heavy rain had delayed the start for an hour, and even as they raced, visibility was little more than 100 yards on the twisting 14-mile circuit with its 172 corners. As they raced on, the fog got thicker, but Scottish driving ace Jackie Stewart, number 6 in a Metro Ford, was piloting his car as though he had built-in radar. Stewart dominated the race. Graham Hill held second place in his Lotus Ford. Though the speed was comparatively slow, there were some dicey moments for some of the drivers. But the 2 leading British racers zoomed on, Hill trying everything he knew to catch the uncatchable Jackie Stewart. Stewart took the checkered flag at an average speed of 86.82 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour below the lap record, but still incredible for the conditions. Graham Hill took second place.
Stewart's brilliant victory took him to 26 points, just 4 behind Graham Hill. Next was the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Honda fielded a second RA301 for David Hobbs. Jackie Ickx was hoping for a home team win. John Surtees took pole in his Honda with Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon alongside. For the first time in months, the race took place in sunny conditions, with Surtees racing into the lead. McLaren was ahead by the time the cars returned at the end of the first lap, and from then on it was a high-speed, slipstreaming duel. Amon crashed and Surtees hit the wall trying to avoid the Ferrari. A battle developed between McLaren, Stewart, Siffert and Hulme. Hill disappeared when a wheel fell off his Lotus. McLaren dropped out when he had to pit for more oil. Hulme built up his lead. Stewart had engine failure on lap 43 and Sivert went out with a rear suspension failure. Denny Hulme crossed the line for a comfortable win. The New Zealander was now third in the championship behind Hill and Stewart. Denny Hulme led Bruce McLaren home in Canada. The result put Hulme and Hill on equal points with 2 races to go.
Le Mans. The tense, excited crowds waited for the start of the greatest endurance race of all. Drivers sprinted to their cars as the clock registered 3 p.m. Full throttle and into the first of so many laps that lay ahead during the next grueling 24 hours. Rain, wind, sunshine. There was every sort of weather condition for man and machine to contend with during this, the 36th Grand Prix of endurance for sports cars. 54 starters, and some of them quickly in trouble. Although in the opening stages of this classic battle there were many dropouts, Germany's 3-litre works Porsches looked pretty well set for a 1-2-3 victory. But eating up the miles with surefire skill and determination was a British-entered 5-litre V8 Ford.
The Pedro Rodriguez Lucien Bianchi GT40 was always in contention. Le Mans was held later in the year than usual after student uprisings had caused the race's postponement. 13 of the 52 starters were Porsches, and during the early laps, 4 of them were leading the field. The Sports Cars Manufacturers' Championship hinged on the result. Ford was only 2 points ahead of Porsche, and a win for either team would also clinch the World Championship. Henri Pescarolo brought the Matra MS630 up to second place until it was sidelined with a fire in a pit stop. Joe Siffert held first place for Porsche but was forced out of the race with electrical gremlins. The Corvette of Sylvain Garon and Jean-Michel Giorgi crashed out. Lucien Bianchi's brother Mauro escaped from a fiery crash when his Alpine's brakes failed at Tertre Rouge. While the Porsche challenge was fading, there was only one GT40 running, but the Rodriguez Bianchi car was 5 laps ahead of the private Porsche 907 of Sperry and Steinemann.
Number 9 was the number to watch, the British car speeding round the clock towards a terrific victory. The pace was the hottest to date. Many couldn't keep it up, but Rodriguez and Bianchi, alternately at the wheel of the British car, were going beautifully.
They took the checkered flag to give Ford the World Sports Car Championship.
That was it. Rodriguez and Bianchi had driven the British-built and entered Ford to victory at an average of 115.2 miles an hour.
Joining the regular drivers at Watkins Glen for the US Grand Prix was Mario Andretti in a Lotus, and he showed his class putting the 49B on pole with Jackie Stewart's Matra sharing the front row. Graham Hill was third. Honda had a single entry for John Surtees. Andretti led away, but Jackie Stewart was ahead by the end of the opening lap. With his Eagle project over, Dan Gurney was driving and spinning a third McLaren. Andretti retired with clutch trouble, but he'd made quite an impression. Graham Hill was in second place. Equal championship leader Denny Hulme's race was over with drive shaft failure. Jackie Stewart crossed the line 24 seconds ahead of Hill and picked up $15,000 for the win, no doubt adding to his happiness on the podium. It also meant he'd closed to within 3 points of Graham Hill with just the Mexican Grand Prix to go. Denny Hulme was 6 points behind, while the other contender Jackie Ickx had missed 2 races with a broken leg. The showdown was in Mexico. Graham Hill took the lead on the first lap. Denny Hulme retired when a rear suspension failure sent him into a guardrail. It was now a straight fight between Hill and Stewart. When Stewart began to drop back with the fuel feed problem, the championship was Hill's to win. And he did so, taking his third Grand Prix victory of the year from Bruce McLaren. Graham Hill was world champion for the second time. Reward for determination in the face of adversity. For 1969, Cosworth would power all the cars except Ferrari and BRM. Could Lotus hold on, or would Jackie Stewart fulfill his potential? 1969, the end of the swinging 60s. Jackie Stewart was in unstoppable form in his Cosworth-powered Matra. The Scots challengers were Jochen Rindt, Denny Hulme, Bruce McLaren, Graham Hill and new Brabham driver Jackie Ickx. And Ickx featured in the closest ever finish at Le Mans, when his GT40 and the Porsche 908 of Hans Hermann went head-to-head in a dramatic race. The Monte Carlo rally was a fight between Porsche 911 drivers Bo Valdegaard of Sweden and Britain's Vic Elford. The rally was decided on the final drama-packed night run through the French Alps. 26-year-old Valdegaard started the 670-kilometre stage with an 89-second lead over Elford. At one point, Elford regained the lead, but soon afterwards he careered off at a bend and hit a tree near the isolated village of Scieri de Sosplos. His Porsche was damaged, but neither he nor co-driver David Stone were injured. So Valdegaard was left with a clear lead, and he and Lars Helmer were greeted with the traditional bouquets and champagne after they crossed the finishing line. Winners of the Coupe des Dames were Patmos Carlsen and co-driver Ellie Nystrom in a Lancia Fulvia. Valdegaard learned to drive at the wheel of a tractor. The Daytona 24-hour race, held on the combined banked and road circuit, started the sports car season. It was set to be a showdown between Porsche and the Ford GT40s, but American teams produced a surprise finish, taking the first 3 places. All 5 of the works Porsches had to retire, as did the John Wyer-run GT40s. The winners were Mark Donoghue and 44-year-old Chuck Parsons, who stepped in at the last minute. There, Roger Penske entered Sunoco Lola T70 Mark IIIB, spent an hour in the pits during the night for repairs, and rejoined 40 laps behind the leading Porsche. But the German cars couldn't stand the pace, and the Lola retook the lead. The Lola was a development of Eric Broadley's original GT, the car that became the GT40. It proved to be an ideal customer car, and with Mark Donoghue's expert preparation was turned into a long-distance race winner. Parsons and Donoghue coaxed the car home, covering 3,840 kilometres over 626 laps for an average speed of 160 kilometres an hour. Second was another Lola T70 driven by Lothar Mochenbacher and Ed Leslie. Third was the Pontiac Firebird driven by John Ward and Jerry Titus. The Formula One Championship began with the South African Grand Prix. Jochen Rindt joined world champion Graham Hill at Lotus. Mario Andretti was making another appearance after his impressive debut in the previous year's US Grand Prix. To replace Rindt, Brabham hired Jackie Ickx from Ferrari. Jack Brabham switched from Repco to Cosworth Power, and the veteran confirmed his intentions by taking pole position. Jackie Stewart was joined at Matra by Jean-Pierre Beltoise. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme had M7As to start the season. Honda, Eagle and Cooper had all disappeared, so Cosworth's DFV dominated the field. Ferrari ran only one car for Chris Amon, while BRM had Jackie Oliver and John Surtees. Jack Brabham took the lead with Jackie Stewart behind him. Then came Rindt, Hill, Hulme and McLaren. At the end of the first lap, Stewart took the lead and he stayed there for the rest of the race. Brabham was second until his rear wing collapsed on lap 7 and Jack was forced to pit. Spindly high wings were de rigueur, but were soon to disappear from Formula One. Rindt moved to second, but he was soon overtaken by new teammate Hill. The Austrian also dropped behind Hulme. Hulme repassed Siffert to take third. Jackie Stewart won by 18 seconds from Graham Hill. Joe Siffert was fourth in the Rob Walker Lotus, Bruce McLaren 5th, and Jean-Pierre Beltoise 6th.
Excuse me, love, you're going to get wired up.
The Sports Car World Championship continued with the BOAC 500-mile race at Brands Hatch. First away was Chris Amon in the Ferrari 312, but Porsche was all out to make up for their failures in earlier rounds at Daytona and Sebring. Joe Sifford and Brian Redman set a scorching pace in the number 53 908, and Porsche's grip on the race was never relaxed. The 3-litre 908, with its air-cooled flat-six engine, was a lightweight car. It was best to avoid having accidents in them. Chris Amon and Pedro Rodriguez in the Ferrari 312P. Jose Joncadella spun the GT40 he was sharing with Gordon Spice. As the Siffert-Redmond Porsche sped past, the Privateer Ford rejoined the race. Chris Kraft and Eric Liddell finished 8th in their Lolo T70, about to be lapped by the leader. Rudi Linz crashed his 907 but was able to walk back to the pits. Gerhard Mitter and Udo Schalz finished 3rd. Sweden's Joe Bonnier crashed his Lola in the last hour of the race. Bonnier was put on a stretcher and taken to the medical centre for a checkup. Vic Elford and Richard Atwood finished 2nd. For Porsche, the win was a great relief, as there had been last-minute ignition troubles in Siffert's car before the start. Siffert and Redmond lapped everyone except their teammates, covering a record 227 laps. Chris Amon and Pedro Rodriguez drove their Ferrari into 4th place. The win put Porsche into the championship lead. A feature race of the Formula 2 season was the 29th Power Grand Prix held on the street circuit of the Pyrenees city. The mix of Grand Prix stars and up-and-comers included Graham Hill, Jochen Rindt, Jackie Stewart and Johnny Servoz-Gavin. Mirroring Formula 1, every car was powered by a Cosworth engine, in this case the 1.6-litre four-cylinder FVA. Jochen Rindt started from pole in his Roy Winkleman-run Lotus 59B. Jackie Stewart retired his Matra with a drive shaft failure. Keeping well clear of the pack was Rindt in the Lotus. Formula 2 allowed drivers who were hoping to progress to Formula 1 the opportunity to test themselves against the best drivers. It also allowed team managers to assess the talent that was available should they need a new driver. Graham Hill's Lotus had a fuel metering belt problem. Jochen Rindt won from the Matra of Jean-Pierre Beltoise, and the Brabham of Piers Courage entered by Frank Williams. 4th was the Matra of Johnny Servoz-Gavin, and 5th, a rising name, François Sever in the Techno. Jackie Stewart won the Spanish Grand Prix in Barcelona, while Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt crashed out when their wings failed. Stewart was now on 18 championship points, well ahead of Denny Hulme. At Monaco, Jochen Rindt was still recovering from his crash, so Lotus hired Richard Atwood alongside Graham Hill. After the first qualifying session, the big wings were banned. Jackie Stewart took pole ahead of Chris Amon, Jean-Pierre Beltoise and Graham Hill. Jackie Oliver's first lap Monaco jinx continued when he crashed his BRM. Stewart led with Amon in pursuit. Hill passed Beltoise for 3rd. By lap 10, Stewart had a 10-second advantage. John Surtees suffered a gearbox failure in the tunnel and was hit by Brabham. Bruce McLaren finished 5th. Amon's Ferrari retired with a differential failure, And on lap 21, Beltoise's Matra suffered a drive shaft failure. Then Stewart had an identical problem with his Matra and retired. That left Graham Hill in the lead, with a 12-second advantage over Ickx and Piers Courage in the Frank Williams-run Brabham. The battle for second continued until lap 49, when Jackie Ickx retired with a rear suspension failure on the works Brabham. That meant Courage finished an impressive second to Hill, with Joe Siffert picking up third. Graham Hill made history by winning at Monaco for the 5th time in 7 years. He was congratulated by Prince Rainier and Princess Grace. Hill moved to second in the championship on 15 points to Jackie Stewart's 18. Porsche was making a determined effort in their home race, the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers. Joe Siffert took pole in the 908. Juan Manuel Fangio was on a trip to Europe to visit friends. Sharing the front row was the Chris Amon-Pedro Rodriguez 312 Ferrari. Away from the rolling start, Siffert raced into the lead, breaking the lap record in his 2-hour stint. The Ferrari lasted until lap 28, when it retired with electrical problems. The Austin Healey Sprite of Martin Davidson and Jack Wheeler. Frank Gardner and David Piper wrestled the fearsome and underdeveloped 917 around 8th place on its debut, relieved they'd made it to the end of the race. Also stopped was the Nanni Galli Ignazio Giunti Alfa Romeo T33. Repaired after its Brands Hatch shunt, the Lola T70 of Joe Bonnier and Herbie Muller. Joe Siffert and Brian Redman went on to win 4 minutes ahead of Rolf Stommelen and Hans Hermann. Vic Elford and West Germany's Kurt Ahrens were third. Victory gave Porsche their 5th consecutive win in World Championship events, having won at Brands Hatch, Monza, the Targa Florio and at Spa. They clinched the World Sports Car Championship, ending a 2-year run of near misses to Ferrari and Ford. To complete their season, Porsche were now primed to win at Le Mans. The stands were full with spectators waiting expectantly for the Le Mans 24-hour race. Porsche had managed to build 25 of the pure racing 917s, which meant they could use 4.5-litre engines rather than the 3-litre prototype limit. The ancient 250LM Ferrari of Teodoro Zeccoli and Sam Posi. Ferrari had 2 3-litre prototypes entered after missing 1968, and Matra was scaling up its involvement.
Le Mans, the famous start of the 24-hour race. There were 45 cars and some of the world's top drivers facing the grueling battle of high-speed endurance. Porsches were hot favourites for all the honours. But as the race opened up, it developed into a real ding-dong battle between the German roadsters and the Ford GT40s. The event was marred by the fatal crash of British driver John Wolfe. The race went on.
While the Porsches led by the Kurt Ahrens Rolf Stommelen 917 blasted away, Jackie Ickx calmly walked across the track to his Ford GT40, fitted his safety belt properly, and was the last to get going. There was a tragedy on the first lap when British privateer driver John Wolfe crashed his 917 at Whitehouse Corner. It burst into flames and Wolfe was killed. Chris Amon jumped clear of his own Ferrari after it hit the Porsche and caught fire. The race was stopped for 2 hours due to these 2 first-lap incidents, but was eventually restarted. At one stage, Porsche held the 5 leading places. The number 6 GT40 of Jackie Ickx and Jackie Oliver moved into contention. This was the same car that had won the previous year in the hands of Pedro Rodriguez and Lucien Bianchi. The wreckage from John Wolfe's fatal crash.
Into the night. The pace was a cracking one. It was certainly a record-breaking speed test.
Vic Elford and Richard Atwood were clinging to the lead in their 917, with Schutz and Gerhard Mitter second in the 908. Gradually, the Porsches began to drop out, and the steady GT40s took over.
Came the dawn. The night had taken its toll. There were the remains of high-speed machinery at several places around the circuit, but those that were still going were going very fast.
There was one Porsche still in contention, the number 64 908 Coupe of Hans Hermann and Gérard Larousse. In the final 2 hours, the X Oliver GT40 fought out a thrilling duel with the Porsche.
For the last 3 hours, the GT40 and the Porsche had swapped the lead. But as they neared the flag, it was the British car which hung on to win. Jackie X and Jackie Oliver had claimed victory by a hair's breadth.
In the most dramatic finish in the history of the race, Jackie X crossed the line just 100 meters ahead of Hans Hermann. That gave Ford its 4th successive win in the classic race, and they bowed out on a winning note. Porsche and Matra, however, were getting serious about winning. Formula One racing resumed with the Dutch Grand Prix, and designers had been busy trying to overcome the loss of downforce since the ban on high wings. One solution was four-wheel drive. Lotus and Matra brought along new cars to try out in the practice sessions, if not the race. Qualifying saw Jochen Rindt taking pole position for Lotus, with Stewart's Matra MS80 second and Hill's Lotus 49 sharing the front row. A 43,000-strong crowd saw Graham Hill jump into the lead, followed by Rindt and Stewart. Hill was passed by Rindt on the 3rd lap. The Austrian led until lap 17 when his Lotus suffered a drive shaft failure. Stewart then took over the lead, which he held for the rest of the race. Ferrari had a single entry for Chris Amon, and from Italy came the news that the prancing horse had essentially been taken over by Fiat, offering them financial security and stability. Graham Hill dropped back with suspension trouble. With Stewart well on his way to victory and Switzerland's Joe Siffert safe in second, the crowd watched the exciting battle for the next 4 places. Chris Amon managed to hold 3rd, followed by fellow New Zealander Denny Hulme, Jackie X and Jack Brabham. Jackie Stewart increased his World Championship lead to 12 points over Graham Hill, who finished out of the points. Jackie Stewart led the French Grand Prix from flag to flag, with Matra teammate Jean-Pierre Beltoise second, the perfect result. Jackie X was 3rd, while Graham Hill was a disappointing 6th.
Silverstone, on the day of the season's most exciting Grand Prix, the British Grand Prix. Work-centred cars from the top racing stables and top drivers from 9 nations, including John Surtees. World champ Graham Hill and Piers Courage prepared to go to the grid and do battle with Jackie Stewart. And there to watch the men of speed was the Duke of Kent. From a good start, the speed quickly built up. Jackie Stewart was the favourite, but everyone was chasing the Flying Scot, including Mexican driver Pedro Rodriguez, number 12. Stewart, Matra Ford, marked number 3, was in tremendous form. Bruce McLaren, number 6, was knocking up a fair rate of knots. But the further they went, the more determined became Stewart, the man with his sights set on the 1969 Drivers' Championship. Number 7, Jackie X, one of the front runners. But the real ding-dong was taking place between Jochen Rindt, number 2, and Stewart. Rindt led the race more often than Stewart, but bad luck waited for him in the later stages. High speeds and hard driving gobbled up the Lotus Ford's petrol at a crucial point. McLaren was hard after Stewart as the finish loomed up, but nobody could catch the Scot, who won at an average speed of 127.25 miles an hour. The Duke of Kent made the presentation to the man who, now barring accidents, is unbeatable in this year's World Drivers' Championship.
It was the Scots' 5th Grand Prix win in 6 races. 3rd place went to Bruce McLaren, who moved up to 2nd in the standings. In the German Grand Prix, Ferrari was missing from the action, and Jack Brabham had broken his ankle during testing at Silverstone. Mario Andretti was trying out the four-wheel drive Lotus 63. Jackie Ickx got away slowly from pole position and was fourth behind Jackie Stewart, Joe Siffert and Bruce McLaren. On the first lap, Andretti crashed his Lotus and Vic Elford clipped an errant wheel which flipped his privately entered McLaren. By lap 3, Ickx moved into second place, close behind Stewart. They pulled away from the rest of the field. On laps 5 and 6, the lead changed 4 times until Stewart's Matra began to have gear selection troubles. That allowed Jackie Ickx to draw away. Among the cars which dropped out was the Formula 2 Lotus Ford of Rolf Stommelen, which caught fire. To bolster the grid, the German Grand Prix for many years included a section for Formula 2 cars, the performance of which sometimes embarrassed the Formula 1 machinery. While Jackie Ickx won the race, Stewart nursed his Matra Ford home to second, 1 minute behind. A further 2 minutes back, Bruce McLaren was third and Graham Hill fourth. Positions 5 to 10 were occupied by Formula 2 cars, with Henri Pescarolo leading the way in his Matra Cosworth. Jackie Ickx moved on to 22 championship points, taking second place in the standings, but he was now 29 behind Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart's narrow win in the Italian Grand Prix, his 6th of the year, gave him the World Championship with 3 races still to go. Jackie Ickx led home team boss Jack Brabham in the Canadian Grand Prix. Jochen Rindt scored his long-awaited first Grand Prix victory at Watkins Glen from Piers Courage. In contrast, Graham Hill's US Grand Prix ended in the back of an ambulance. Hill was running in 6th place, but had a spin and had to push start his car. As a result, he was unable to do up his seatbelts and on lap 91 spun again. This time, the car overturned and Hill was thrown out, breaking both legs. Hill travelled back to England on a special bed fixed across a row of seats in the Transworld Airlines jet. He began a rigorous rehabilitation program over the winter, determined that even at 40, his racing days weren't over. The final Grand Prix of the 1960s took place in Mexico City. Denny Hulme led home Jackie Ickx, Jack Brabham and Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart's consistency, combined with the reliability of the Cosworth-powered Matra, meant a well-deserved World Championship. 6 wins from 11 races had been a dominating performance.